BloombergQuint. Now, while the world fights a pandemic and the great lockdown, as the IMF calls it, there was a separate drama playing out in the largest commodity market, and that is oil. A high stakes game between Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the United States that eventually became, as some have called it, a Mexican standoff, because that tiny country almost succeeded in putting an agreement to peril. But Mexico was convinced, and a giant cartel, bigger than OPEC and OPEC Plus, has now agreed to cut oil production by close to 10 million barrels per day, starting the 1st of May. And yet the price of oil keeps sinking. The last we checked, WTI was down below $20 at close to 18. Can the oil market come back from the brink? Well, joining me to answer that is an expert voice, the IEA's Fatih Birol. Dr. Birol, thank you very much for your time here today on BloombergQuint, and I do hope you're in good health.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. We are in good health in confinement in Paris, in France, like you yourselves in New Delhi. So we are all impatiently waiting for these days to go over.
Absolutely, sir. India is also experiencing a very long lockdown right now for health reasons. Let me get to the oil market. You called April a black April, if I understand correctly.
Yes.
What is the IEA forecast for the next few months and for 2020?
Now, I call this month as Black April. The reason is that we expect this month global oil demand to decline about 30 million barrels per day, about a 30% decline. And this is huge. And throughout the year, we expect this year, 2020, global oil demand will decline, will drop more than 9 million barrels per day. To put this in a context, you just mentioned the IMF. For example, IMF said the day before our report, IMF said that the global economy will decline 3% this year. This would mean that the global economic growth of 1 year is going to be erased, because 2019, last year, global economy increased 2.9%, and this year expected to decline 3%. So it means it's going to erase the last year. But when it comes to oil, the 9 million barrels per day decline this year means erasing 10 years, almost 1 decade of growth in global oil consumption. So there is a big disproportionate impact of this coronavirus on the oil industry. And as such, this year is very difficult. This quarter is very difficult. And this month, April, is a big decline. And as a result of that, I call it a black April of the global oil industry.
Dr. Birol, you had a ringside seat to the high drama we've seen play out in the oil geopolitical market. And the reason I put it that way is because this was clearly about the survival of the industry for certain countries. I want you to talk us through how you view this agreement that has been come upon by the United States, Saudi Arabia, Russia, OPEC, OPEC Plus, and all the other players, including Mexico, to cut close to 10 million barrels per day in production starting the 1st of May. Let's talk the politics of this first, and then I will get to what the impact this will have on supply and prices.
In past week, there were 2 extremely important international meetings. One of them was the OPEC Plus countries meeting, which ended up with an agreement of cutting the production about 10 million barrels per day, because we have a huge amount of balloon of oil in the markets. This is number one. Number two, as important as that, if not more important, there was a meeting of G20 countries, which was initiated by the International Energy Agency. I have called the Prince Abdulaziz, the Saudi oil minister, because Saudi Arabia is the chair of G20, and Saudi Arabia brought G20 countries around the table. And as a result of oil diplomacy, and I also had very good discussions with the Minister Pradhan of India. Why this meeting was important? Because it brought around the virtual table countries who are responsible about 70% of global oil production and 80% of global oil consumption. And as a result of this G20 meeting, two important outcomes. Number one, some producing countries such as United States, Canada, Brazil, Norway, when they said that they will see their production will see a decline, which is, according to our estimates, an additional 3.5 million barrels per day. This is one. Second, some countries such as India, China, Korea, and United States, they said they are going to buy oil to put in their strategic petroleum reserves. This is also important because it will give a lifeline to the on one hand to the oil markets, and at the same time, it is going to since it is very cheap to put the oil in the reserves is a good thing for the energy security. And this effort is, in our view, is equivalent to getting 2 million barrels per day, absorbing additional 2 million barrels per day from the markets. Now, these three things put together, OPEC plus agreement. From G20, some countries' production will decline, plus buying oil from strategic from the oil markets and putting in their strategic reserves, did not end up by an increased rebound because the demand decline is so huge. These efforts had only to minimize or reduce the impact of the demand collapse on the oil industry. If these steps were not taken, then the oil prices, the oil industry would face even much serious challenges as we see today.
Fair enough, Dr. Birol, and you've explained, the dynamics of the industry very, very clearly. But there is some politics to this as well, right? The involvement of the U.S. in order to protect its shale gas industry, in the face of potentially very large job cuts at a time when the economy is already being decimated by the coronavirus pandemic, is what helped cement this deal. It was President Trump's intervention that helped bring Saudi and Russia and then many other countries to the table, eventually also Mexico. And so I'm just curious as to how you view the geopolitics of this deal and whether you think these geopolitics will stick.
I think the implications are for everybody. Let me tell you that you are completely right that as we have highlighted in our report, U.S. shale industry will be negatively affected from that. Many people in the United States working in the oil industry will lose their jobs. But they are not the only one. The shock waves in the oil industry will affect not only the workers in the U.S. oil industry, but also workers in the refineries. Refineries are all around the world. It is in Japan, it is in China, it is in India, it is in Europe as well. It will affect the people, the workers in the retail fuel stations, pump stations. There will be a big wave of unemployment coming here. And when it comes to geopolitics, to be honest with you, there is a lot of interest between U.S. among U.S. what is happening with Russia, Saudi Arabia. But I am more worried about the countries like Iraq, Nigeria, Algeria, Angola, these countries, because in these countries, the oil is the most important, if not the only, revenue. I was just talking with the Iraqi minister. In Iraq, with the current oil revenues, it is only enough to pay the half of the salaries of the government employees. Leave aside the spending in the health sector, social services, and in many countries, the current situation in the vulnerable oil-producing countries, it may well have implications beyond oil, beyond economy, but social and geopolitical implications.
Yeah, fair enough. I get the point, and therefore the reason why I brought up the geopolitics, it is not my suggestion that the oil industry should be allowed to flounder, but the reason I brought it up was because despite the agreements that you've discussed, whether at the OPEC plus level or at the G20 level, or the decision to purchase and for strategic reserves, we're still continuing to see oil prices decline in the face of what is incredible economic weakness, very low demand across the world. And so therefore,
Yes.
what is it going to take? I mean, where will prices go from now? Because I understand that the near-term prices are under more pressure than the medium-term prices, but also, will the discipline of this very large cartel be maintained?
Yeah. So I would expect that this quarter, especially this month, we will see further downward pressure on the prices. But if the countries in the OPEC Plus or G20 countries would do what they said they would do, and if we see the confinement measures are lifted slowly but surely, we may well see second half of this year the oil markets start to revive and the oil demand to pick up. But in order to see this second half of this year, a revival of the oil markets, there are two conditions. One, 100% compliance on those agreements and output cuts. And second, the gradual lifting of the confinement. Because the issue is, even oil is cheap, people are not able to use it because nobody can make use of cheap gasoline because they cannot drive. You cannot make use of cheap airline tickets because you cannot fly. So therefore, as important as the producers' next steps, it is very important what will happen with the confinement measures, whether or not there will be a gradual lifting. If so, if these things go in the right direction, we may well see second half of this year the oil markets to revive.
Dr. Birol, what kind of recovery in prices are you estimating in the second half of this year based on the two conditions that you put down and based on also the third condition of maybe some recovery in the global economy?
So if these three things come together, the cuts will be implemented in a 100% manner. If the coronavirus challenge is somehow gradually met, and if we see the impact of the stimulus packages of the countries, we may well see a gradual recovery of the demand. I do not expect a very strong rebound of oil demand. There will be a significant growth, but this will be rather gradual and slow. I do not expect that the oil demand second half of this year can be at the same time, at the same level that we had before the coronavirus problem.
Will it prepare itself for, let's say, oil prices between $20 to $30 if all the conditions you've laid out are met in the second half of this year?
I think we may see the oil prices gradually recover from current levels, but I do not expect that we will see a skyrocketing of the prices. And here it is very important that we also, in these difficult conditions, we also think about the physical access to energy products, because people are in the confinement. And in many countries I see there are challenges that the citizens cannot have access to oil products. Here I am very pleased that the Indian government, for example, just to give an example, that they give a free LPG to many citizens, and I think this is something that is exemplary, the LPG, free LPG in the context of Ujjwala program.
Fair enough, sir. Just a couple of last few questions, I think, just to get a better sense of, how you see the road ahead. I think one of the questions that had to do with, you made this point earlier on in your first answer, that there was a commitment by consuming countries like India and China to make the best of this low price period and to fill up their strategic oil reserves. There has been some data put out with regards to how full these strategic oil reserves are for various countries. Have we reached capacity level already? I'm not just talking India specific, but across the world. Or do you think that that could continue to be a source of demand for the next month or two?
So there are 4 countries who made those steps, including India, China, United States, and Korea. At least 4 countries. I think it's a very clever political step, because it is when it is cheap, you put it aside, and when the prices go up, you have it in your stocks for the rainy days in the global oil markets. We shouldn't expect that the prices will always remember $20, and it is a very good way to go. Currently, those efforts in our estimates is equal to 2 million barrels per day. But when we look globally, there is so much oil in the markets that sometime around June, we may see a big chunk of the storage capacity in the world maybe coming to its full capacity. So again, if we were not successful to have the G20 meeting and the decision, or the OPEC Plus meeting, the full storage capacity would be reached much earlier, and it would have been even a more serious problem for the oil industry.
But if I understood correctly, what you're saying is, if the G20 discipline and the OPEC Plus discipline is maintained, then this full capacity situation might get pushed to beyond June. Is that correct?
Yes, it could be coming around June, but if there was no G20 decision, if there was no the OPEC Plus decision, instead of June, this reaching the full storage capacity would have been even earlier.
Okay. So if I may ask you a smaller question in regard of this larger one, would you know how much India has purchased for its strategic oil capacity or reserve? Because we don't have any data from the government at all. So I just wanted to know if there's any broader data available in the market.
I think it is Mr. Pradhan, who is one of the leaders of the global energy diplomacy, would give a better answer to you. But what we know is that India's strategic reserves first phase has combined a capacity about 40 million barrels, and this means that these facilities are about 55%. So this is the data we have, but the official number you may want to get from Mr. Pradhan's office.
Okay, I will try my best. You mentioned that by June we might reach full capacity for strategic reserves for most countries in the world, at least the large ones. And so my question to you then is, the worst case scenario. If the discipline on the producers holds not fully but partly, if demand or containment measures around the pandemic continue on, and therefore there is no revival in demand, even a minor one, then what happens? I mean, can you physically explain to us if the world runs out of storage capacity in June, July?
Then we would see that the oil prices, if such a scenario happens, which is definitely a nightmare scenario for the oil industry, global oil industry, consumers or producers alike, we would see a few things. Among them, oil prices will go even further down the current levels. There will be millions of oil-related workers losing their jobs, and them and the families they are supporting will be affected. Third, several countries who are relying on oil revenues for their economies. I mentioned to you a few of them. but almost all of them, their economies, social situation, and political stability will be negatively affected. So there will be a lot of negative implications around the world. Therefore, it is very important that those countries will do what they said they will do. I don't think that those countries cannot afford to not to follow the steps what they have described in the meetings in the last week. Okay.
So one last question, and this is from a consuming point of view or a consumer point of view. While I understand that the coming together of all these countries, including under the umbrella of the G20, was important to keep the oil industry breathing, as a consumer, I must ask about the concern of an even bigger cartel that we're today faced with. The OPEC cartel first, then in the more recent years, the OPEC plus cartel, and now we have the OPEC plus cartel that is going to determine oil prices. As consumers, what should we make of this?
So I don't think that we can consider the countries like United States or Canada, Brazil, and Norway, and the others are part of the OPEC plus group. If it was so, there wouldn't be an additional meeting on last Friday, and with the consumers together. I think why I asked for such a meeting of G20 nations around the world is that the situation came to a level that it is becoming a major risk for the global economic stability and global financial stability. And the collapse of the oil industry would have sent a huge shockwaves beyond the oil industry, as it is one of the pillars of the global economy. And therefore, we should all hope that the time we gained through OPEC Plus and, more importantly, G20 meeting can be used wisely, and that the oil industry make the right steps, and it can survive. As we all know, that we still need oil industry for natural gas industry for years to come. If you can think, today the masks we use around the world, 90% of these masks are products of the petrochemical industry. The sanitizers to clean our hands, hand sanitizers, they are all products of the oil industry. So we should be all hoping that the oil industry can survive, and the workers, engineers in the oil fields, refineries, pump stations can keep their jobs. Okay.
Fatih Birol, thank you so much for your patience in answering all my questions, and I hope you stay well. Thank you for your time here on BloombergQuint.
Same to you. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
According to a recent report, women today contribute nearly 74% of real estate buying decisions. This